You're listening to The World at 8 with Lynn Mozart. The World at 8, the number one in nationalist news.
Highlights of the news today, Friday the 27th of September 2013. Coalition must act over high energy bills, say senior Tories. Unemployed to do unpaid work or lose benefits. Target Britain, fanatics behind Kenya massacre planned UK reign of terror. Golden Door wiretapped and threatens to destabilise Greek government. Gypsy gangs underestimated. French police clear Roma camp in centre of Roubaix. Nick Griffin MEP, who today talks about global warming and very much more. US window of opportunity to peacefully settle nuclear standoff with Iran. BBC finally offers a bit of unbiased good news on Syrian chemical weapons. Bloody weekend, trend of Muslim rage against infidels continues. Thought for the day, a little feng shui thought. And finally, not so kinky the Welsh, is it? UK news. Coalition must act over high energy bills, say senior Tories. The Guardian reports Conservatives fear Ed Miliband struck chord with Public, but Labour divided as Peter Mandelson disagrees with price freeze. David Cameron is facing calls from his own party to tackle high energy bills and the dominance of the big six companies after Ed Miliband promised to freeze gas and electricity prices. Several senior Tories put pressure on the coalition to respond with its own plan as they admitted Miliband had identified public concern about the energy market with his proposal for a 20-month freeze. Tim Yeo, the elected chairman of the Energy Committee, said he hoped the Labour leader's intervention would spark a very strong focus on how energy bills can be kept down, while Anthony Nelson, a former Treasury Minister who later became a Labour supporter, said Miliband was right to call for a freeze as the market isn't working properly and desperately needs reform. Education Secretary Michael Gove, appearing on BBC One's Question Time, said he took claims by the companies that Labour's plans for a 20-month price freeze would lead to power blackouts with a pinch of salt. Gove said the Labour leader had been absolutely right to say energy prices were too high. Unemployed to do unpaid work or lose benefits. The unemployed will have to do unpaid full-time work or lose their benefits in a bid to reduce the amount spent on the jobless. Under proposals expected to be announced next week at the Conservative conference, people who have been out of work for a long time will be expected to earn their benefits by working for firms unpaid or in the community. It's been suggested adopting a new US-style work for the dole scheme will help reduce Britain's large benefits bill. It's expected that those who fail to find jobs through the government's main back-to-work scheme, the Work Programme, will have to work for their payment, sources told the Daily Mail. Ian Duncan-Smith, the Work and Pensions Secretary, told the newspaper it's not acceptable for people to expect to live a life on benefits if they're able to work. Sources in the Department for Work and Pensions describe the reports as pure speculation. However, they didn't deny that the plans are being considered by ministers. Target Britain, fanatics behind Kenya massacre planned UK reign of terror. Muslim terrorists behind the Kenya shopping centre massacre plan to attack high-profile British targets, including the Ritz Hotel and Eton Public School. Members of the Al-Shabaab terror group also set their sights on London suburbs such as Golders Green and Stamford Hill. They listed targets in the training manual, which contained a blueprint for this week's gun and bomb rampage at Nairobi's Westgate shopping mall. Al-Shabaab's international operations document was recovered after one of its most feared warlords was gunned down in Somalia. It said, "Our objectives are to strike London with low-cost operations that would cause a heavy blow amongst the hierarchy." One British-based security expert said yesterday that an Al-Qaeda-backed attack on a UK shopping centre was a distinct possibility. The revelations came amidst forensic inquiries into the terror attack in Nairobi, which left at least 67 people dead. World at 8 comments, "I don't think even these idiots would develop the balls enough to do it. Kenya was a different matter in reality." European news. Golden Dawn wiretapped and threatens to destabilise Greek government. The Greek intelligence service has placed wiretaps inside the communications of Golden Dawn. In a turbulent 24 hours for Greece, anti-fascist protests became violent, an army website demanded the resignation of the government, and an official admitted they planted wiretaps in the communications of a neo-Nazi political party. On Wednesday, at least 10,000 people demonstrated in Athens in an anti-fascist protest organised by unions and political parties. But the protest descended into violence when demonstrators tried to approach Golden Dawn's central offices in Athens. Tear gas was fired after dozens of hooded demonstrators, some wearing motorcycle helmets, broke off from the initially peaceful march that police blocked from reaching the party's offices. Police chased small groups of protesters through the streets. Golden Dawn is now Greece's third most popular political party. Golden Dawn threatens to spark snap elections by pulling all 18 of its members from the 300-seat parliament. If Golden Dawn members walk out, then special elections would have to take place in every district they represent in order to replace them. Golden Dawn leader Michail Oliarchos on Thursday, 26 December, said some polls indicate the opposition would win, which could undermine the ruling coalition, reports Reuters. World at 8. It's always the anti-fascists that act like real fascists when doing demos. They want to be careful. Golden Dawn could well pull off making Greece a nationalist socialist country. Good luck to them. Listen to the next news item and you'll understand why this is happening in Europe. Gypsy gangs underestimated. The Dutch underestimate the danger of roaming gypsy gangs from Eastern Europe. They are very professional, well organised and trained criminals who steal to order, Utrecht criminologists say in a weekly magazine, Vrij Nederland. The criminologists did research for a unit of the National Police Academy. Professor Dina Siegel and her team investigated the composition of the gangs, the offences, the methods of operation, the final destination of the loot and the prevention and repression measures of the government from 2008 to 2012. The biggest danger, Siegel said, came from pickpockets, car and shop thieves, skimmers, racketeers, burglars and beggars. They know well ahead of time what and how much they want, down to brands and types. The money obtained mostly goes to their home country, where it is invested in property and cars. Retail interest group Detail Handel Netherlands says the gypsy gangs involved cause €250 million worth of damage to the Dutch economy every year. Of this, €206 million is from shoplifting and between €40 million and €50 million for shop break-ins. Police research revealed that 21% of the shop thefts were committed by mobile gangs from Central and Eastern Europe, led by Romanians. Siegel says almost all of them are gypsies. World at 8 states, you can take the boy out of the country, but you can't take the country out of the boy. French police clear Roma camp in centre of Roubaix. Police in the northern French town of Roubaix have dismantled a Roma gypsy camp, days after the Interior Minister said most Roma should be expelled. Officers moved in around 0700 to remove caravans parked in the sprawling camp as Roma families hastily packed up their belongings. Many people have already left the camp where 200 people were living during the night, French media reported. On Wednesday, Interior Minister Manuel Valls drew criticism for his stance. After the socialist minister said few Roma could ever integrate into French society and the majority should be sent back to the borders, human rights campaigners, the European Commission and one of his cabinet colleagues voiced indignation. Mr Valls has encouraged local councils to systematically dismantle illegal Roma slums and offer the expelled residents free flights back to their countries of origin. He has also been at the forefront of French opposition to allowing Bulgaria and Romania full access to the passport-free Schengen zone. World at 8 comments, he is quite right. One must look after one's own country and people first, or else you should be on the EU committees, which clearly don't. No one wants the Romas, even the Romas don't want the Romas. I now hand you over to Nick Griffin MEP, who talks today about climate change, man-made global warming, big oil and the Gaia cult.
Naturally, I'm busy today with preparations for our conference over the weekend, but just briefly I wanted to touch on the news today out with the International Panel on Climate Change and their latest alarmist report. It's something really very important, obviously, in the European Union. Day after day after day, I see ways in which the liberal left are trying to use still the myth of man-made climate change as an excuse for taxes, interference and global government. It's becoming a joke, but it's still very, very important for people to understand why they're doing it, why they're wrong, and what can be done to help to counter it. So, looking at things briefly, you probably have seen in the news and the BBC running the IPCC headline saying that they're now 97% sure that global warming is happening and it's man-made. This despite, of course, the fact that the small print shows there's been a desperate scramble by this internationalist body to cover up the fact that, in fact, there's been no global warming at all since 1997. The computer models on which the whole man-made global warming story is based entirely fail to predict this inconvenient fact, from which you have to understand that the computer models are utterly useless. Yet the only evidence they have for their claims are those same computer models. So without those, they're not working, there is nothing. Man-made global warming is a hoax. The IPCC is trying to say that virtually all scientists now are confident that it's actually going on. Look at the reality. Look up online the Oregon petition and you'll find 31,500 American scientists have signed that Oregon petition dismissing fears of catastrophic global warming and climate disruption. Over 1,000 international scientists dissent from the man-made global warming claims. Claims as a 97% consensus by the IPCC are simple lies. You've got people such as a very well-known US climate expert, Professor Judith Curry, saying, quote, uncertainty is getting bigger, unquote, within the academic community. She suggests that in fact we're entering a period of cooling, similar to that of 1965 to 1975, when the very same people, now coming up with a global warming tale, were predicting an ice age. Is it getting colder? Well, it certainly looks like it in the Antarctic this year, where after all the fuss they made last year about a record shrinkage in the global sea ice, in the Arctic sea ice, the climate change people aren't mentioning the fact that in the last year there's been a 60% increase, a complete bounce back, the sort of thing you'd expect in fact when you're simply dealing with natural cycles which really we can't yet begin to understand. A couple of years ago they were saying that as a result of global warming the Northwest Passage for shipping around the north side of the globe would be open all year round. They were saying that Arctic sea ice would disappear in 2013. Now it's grown 60% back and the Northwest Passage has remained blocked to any shipping by pack ice absolutely all year. So why are there really so many people in internationalist organisations, in various governments and in the mass media trying to use this blatant lie still as a way of saying that we've got to change radically how we live, we've got to give up on all sorts of things? What's going on? There's various factors here in play. One of them is simple money. Big oil in particular is desperately trying to kill coal because coal is a major competitor. And here, despite the claims that the global warming deniers like me are supposedly funded by big oil, the reality is very different. One oil company alone, Chesapeake Energy, gave £25 million to the US-based environmentalist Sierra Club just to advance that very radical leftist organisation's campaign against coal. That's the reality of what's going on here. The Deep Greens are in fact financed by big oil in order to knock out coal, to knock out nuclear power, to make sure that the only thing left is oil, gas fracking, and in particular, because they're pushing so much wind farms, as I'm sure you know, are absolutely useless in many times of the winter when it's cold, it's foggy, when you most need the power. So the more we spend on wind farms, the more in the end they'll say we have to have gas power stations. That's why Britain has to have fracking, the rest of the world has to have fracking, and guess who has the technology to do the fracking? Yep, you've got it, big oil. So they're very heavily involved in it. Then, of course, there's the carbon traders and the big companies making so much from carbon trading and everything that's gone along with the global warming hoax. Al Gore, the main man responsible for it, if you look at any one individual, has become a billionaire because of what's been done to supposedly counter the myth that he created with his absurd hockey stick graph. So he's benefited. The big banks are heavily involved in carbon trading. It's one of the bubbles that they've created because banks need bubbles to make money. It's as simple as that. The whole carbon trading business, and in fact the whole global warming scam, is really designed and working to tax ordinary people, poor people, hard-working people, tax-paying people, and to put the money gouged out of us into the hands of the elite. So follow the money trail. On top of that, though, you've got things far deeper, far more sinister. Look up online Maurice Strong, the United Nations expert, who's been so heavily involved in climate change as a way of developing global governance. They started it in the 1970s when they were threatening us with an ice age. They switched because temporarily things were warming up. But in each case, whatever their excuse, their aim is the same: to create a global enemy that can only be fought by building a global government, because that's what they wanted in the first place. On top of that very sinister and nevertheless, in a way, practical ideological aim, you've also got to understand to think that what we're dealing with in man-made global warming is in fact literally a religious mania. The idea of Gaia, the earth goddess, this is something very, very ancient. It taps into one of the great archetypes of human psychology. This idea, the earth goddess against whom we've committed terrible offences, we've unleashed some invisible demon in the sky. And in the old days, of course, it was a god. Now it's carbon dioxide. And because of this, the earth goddess, she's sick and she's angry with us. And the only way to placate her, the only way to save ourselves, to save the world, is to sacrifice our most valued things to her. In our case, industry, foreign holidays in planes, and vast, vast amounts of money. Even the beauty of our landscape has to be sacrificed to Gaia with those monstrous and utterly useless wind farms. In your own life, you have to make little sacrifices to Gaia every day when they make you sort out your rubbish because it's better for the environment. No, it's not, because in the end, when they dump the rubbish that you so painstakingly are forced by the council to separate, they dump it in the same landfill sites because they're happy because they've met the target for a certain percentage of the waste being separated by the time it gets to the council. That's what's going on here. It's not practical. It's not reasonable. It's not doing any good. But it's all about making sacrifices to the great earth goddess. I think what we're dealing with here overall is a society where it's lost faith in our traditional God, in our traditional religion. Religiosity is something which is innate in large numbers of human beings, and if you create, as the secular left have done, a vacuum, something else will fill it. It's being filled on the one hand by Gaia, the earth goddess, on the other increasingly by the threat of people converting to and being affected by Islam. So the two there go hand in hand because they come from the same roots, which is the destruction of our traditional religious values, creating a gap which has to be filled in some way. It's being filled by these monstrous, very wasteful, very destructive fake gods and goddesses instead. The whole thing has to be killed. It's going to be very difficult to kill it off because, as I've shown you, there's so many very powerful vested interests there with very good reasons, lots of money reasons to keep it going. It's going to be difficult to kill, but it has to be killed. It has to be killed off not least because of the cost of it. £18 billion a year is what the condemned government, with the full support of the Labour Party, because the Climate Change Act was passed under the last Labour government, that's what it's costing us in Britain alone. It's what it's costing you as a taxpayer. £18 billion a year. Compare that with the £500 million that they're screwing out of the poor of this country with their bedroom tax. So let's look at that figure again. £500 million screwed out of inflicting appalling misery on hundreds of thousands of people, to have to make it 36 times worse before they would cover the cost of climate change mitigation measures imposed by the government to the people of this country. Look at it another way. £18 billion a year on climate change nonsense is nearly double the real value, £10.8 billion, which was saved by every government spending cut in the whole of last year. So with climate change, they've blown every last spending cut twice over. That's the cost of this thing. £18 billion a year on climate mitigation costs is similar to the cost of the entire 8-year Afghan war. But instead of being in 8 years, it's in 1 year. And instead of being a one-off, it's every year for the next 30 years. £18 billion a year being gouged out of us and rising because of this appalling climate change hoax. That's why it's important to get it across to people. This isn't some little politically correct joke. It's not something which is a bunch of silly academics who get lots of money for coming up with the right things so their research grants keep on coming. It's not about that. It's about an enormous war on the British taxpayer, on every single person in this country, and we need to expose this fact. We need to make people understand it. We need to make them say, come election times, we will not vote for any party which has stood by and which has helped this appalling fraud against the British taxpayer, against every single person in Britain. The best way you can do that, I would say, is to get on What's Up With That. Type it in, all as one word, without the apostrophe. What's Up With That? It's the best climate change reality site on the internet. Get it, read it, and then get out there on the internet, get into every single newspaper comment section and post wherever you possibly can, even if you can't find an excuse. Put it on the gardening pages, put it on the cooking pages, put it particularly on forums that aren't moderated. Just put links to What's Up With That so that we help to spread out there amongst the ordinary general public not just a vague scepticism about the man-made global warming nonsense, but actually an informed recognition that it is a hoax. It's an appalling rip-off directed at all of us by our political elite. The only way to stop it is to get rid of that political elite. And of course the best way to do that is to vote, join, become active with the British National Party.
Thanks very much, Nick. BBC Two this morning had a panel discussing climate change and global warming. As near this reporter could tell, there was a moderator, 3 global warming supporters and 1 non-supporter. During the whole fast, the non-supporter was consistently interrupted by all and sundry, most often the moderator. At the same time, when the global warming supporters were speaking, the moderator took great pain to ensure they were not interrupted, going so far on numerous occasions to ensure everyone on the panel was told not to interrupt the speaker. World news. US window of opportunity to peacefully settle nuclear standoff with Iran. The US is hopeful that years of standoffs over Iran's nuclear programme are coming to an end after UN talks. Secretary of State John Kerry met one-on-one with the Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif at the end of the summit, shaking his hand and sitting beside him in the highest level contact between the two nations for 6 years. However, officials want the Islamic nation to draw up a detailed plan of action to reassure the world it's not secretly trying to develop an atom bomb. It's reported by the Daily Mail that fresh talks will happen next month after process was fast-tracked. Iran's President Hossein Rouhani is facing criticism at home for accepting the Holocaust happened and has asked Israel to join a nuclear treaty. World at 8 states. Sensible man. BBC finally offers a bit of unbiased good news on Syrian chemical weapons. Experts from the world's chemical weapons watchdog will begin inspecting Syria's stockpile by Tuesday, a draft agreement says. The draft also unusually authorises the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, OPCW, to investigate sites not declared by Damascus. The text is due to be voted on at a meeting at The Hague later on Friday. It will then be incorporated into a UN Security Council resolution calling on Syria to give up its chemical weapons. The resolution will condemn the use of chemical weapons in an attack on the outskirts of Damascus last month, which killed hundreds of people, but will not attribute blame. The draft agreement calls for urgent funding to hire inspectors and technical experts to destroy an estimated 1,000 tonnes of chemical agents and precursor chemicals, including the blister agent, sulphur mustard, and the nerve agents sarin and VX. Established to enforce the CWC, the OPCW has an annual budget of less than £62 million and fewer than 500 staff. Experts say the disarmament operation in Syria could cost billions of dollars. Bloody weekend. Trend of Muslim rage against infidels continues. Muslim slaughter of non-Muslim infidels saw an especially dramatic weekend in the nations of Pakistan and Kenya. Even so, these are simply the latest in a long list of jihadi attacks on the Christians of both nations. Last Sunday, September 22nd, in Peshawar, Pakistan, Islamic suicide bombers entered the All Saints Church compound right after Sunday Mass and blew themselves up in the midst of some 550 congregants, killing, according to the latest count, nearly 90 worshippers, including many Sunday school children, women and choir members, and injuring at least another 120. The now destroyed Protestant church was built in Peshawar some 130 years ago. The Taliban claimed the attacks. World at 8 comments, "Of course this is open warfare and discrimination against Christians. It opens several doors, doesn't it?" Thought for the day, a little feng shui thought. It's Friday, our conference starts tomorrow and I am winding down. We have had Nick's very interesting input which has just given me a little thought. And believe it or not, this thought centres around the Chinese, but not the effluvium that they shove into the atmosphere with awful regularity. Now the West has been fascinated by the East for centuries, mainly because it's so far away and in reality hasn't been opened up to Western culture or trade for very long, in fact just since the early 1800s. And of course we had the Opium Wars as well. Although the West blotted their copybook with this particular war, opium had been used in China since around 1430 AD. It came by way of Arab traders, but the opium itself came from Egypt. At around 330 BC, Alexander the Great introduced opium to Persia. This was not the first time that opium had been sent to Persia, however. Some 3,000 years earlier the Sumerians were trading opium with them. With the decline of the Sumerians, however, opium stopped being imported. As a result, opium vanished from the Persian culture. So when Alexander brought it there, it was a new commodity. Although the Chinese are usually imagined to ingest opium by smoking, it was primarily drunk, just as it was elsewhere, for the first 1,000 years it was used. It was the Dutch who began the practice of combining opium with tobacco and smoking it in a pipe around 1500. This practice was introduced to the Chinese about 200 years later by the Portuguese. Smoking opium quickly caught on in China. The Anglo-Chinese Opium Wars were the direct result of China's isolationist and exclusionary trade policy with the West. Confucian China's attempt to exclude pernicious foreign ideas resulted in highly restricted trade. Prior to the 1830s, there was but one port open to Western merchants, Guangzhou, Canton, and but one commodity that the Chinese would accept in trade, silver. British and American merchants, anxious to address what they perceived as a trade imbalance, determined to import the one product that the average Chinese did not themselves have, but which an ever-increasing number of them wanted: opium. Before 1828, large quantities of the Spanish silver coin, the Corollas, flowed into China in payment for the exotic commodities that Europeans craved. In contrast, in the decade of the 1830s, despite an imperial decree outlawing the export of yellow gold and white silver, only $7 million worth of silver was imported, whereas the silver exported was estimated at $26 million in the foreign silver coin, $25 million in Sicey and $3 million in gold. Although the Chinese imperial government had long prohibited the drug except for medicinal use, the British Hong companies such as Dent, Jardine and Matheson, authorised to operate in Canton, bought cheaply produced opium in the Bengal and Malwa princely districts under the auspices of the British East India Company. The number, 150-pound chests of the narcotic being imported, rising from 9,708 in 1820 to 35,445 in 1835. With the British government's 1833 cancellation of the trade monopoly enjoyed by the East India Company, cheap opium flooded the market, and China's net outflow of silver amounted to some 34 million Mexican silver dollars over the course of the 1830s. As the habit of smoking opium spread from the idle rich to 90% of all Chinese males under the age of 40 in the country's coastal regions, business activity was much reduced, the civil service ground to a halt, and the standards of living fell. The Emperor Daogang's special anti-opium commissioner Li Zhengzhu, 1785 to 1850, modestly estimated the number of his countrymen addicted to the drug to be 4 million, but a British physician practising in Canton set the figure at 12 million. By the late 1830s, foreign merchant vessels, notably those of Britain and the United States, were landing over 30,000 chests annually. Meantime, corrupt officials in the Hopo customs office and ruthless merchants in the port cities were accumulating wealth beyond all the tea in China by defying imperial interdictions that had existed in principle since 1796. The standard rate for an official's turning a blind eye to the importation of a single crate of opium was 80 taels. Between 1821 and 1837, the illegal importation of opium, theoretically a capital offence, increased fivefold. A hotbed of vice, bribery and disloyalty to the Emperor's authority, the opium port of Canton would be the flashpoint for the inevitable clash between the governments of China and Great Britain, and of course the First Opium War was just that. So two things emerged from this. One, rich Chinese had been able to procure forms of opium for hundreds of years, and the West bringing in cheaper forms of the drug just fuelled an already well burnt fire. It's happened in many countries and it's happening in the UK now. We're being flooded by drugs, many of which are man-made in China, so turnabout is fair play, isn't it? But it says a lot for the Chinese character. They will wait many years to achieve what they want, and this trait has not been lessened by the communist ethos. I used to admire the Chinese of the old culture, the children of the emperor. Their cities and culture and their loyalty to their country were all admirable. Their so-called human rights records are a bit off to say the least, and as for their animal rights, well, suffice to say, if I come back again, I don't want to come back as any animal other than a sodding panda in China, and even then I'd be given IVF or worse. No medicines that need bile from live small bears, or tigers' testicles from that awful breeding tiger farms, or rhino horn or elephant's tusks is necessary when the people that these things are made for are making chemical cocktails to feed us in the West. Surely they can do away with the culture of animal bits in the light of progress and the actual century that they are in. The Chinese have already invaded Africa and make no bones about it. They don't treat the Africans very well. I did see a very odd thing when up at Terminal 5, and that was a small Chinese girl with a child of around 2, and this child was a Shigro, which is what Ian Fleming called this mixture in his book Dr. No. He or she had a round pale African face with Chinese eyes and a mop of frizzy black hair, bless it. So obviously they're taking the population control very seriously in another country. What better way to control an indigenous population than by outbreeding it? They seem all set to go into Eastern Europe in the Ukraine, and this must be watched. They're doing it the right way, financially, but they've arranged to buy back the goods produced at a reduced rate. Now this isn't good. If they're using Ukrainian workers, then this will bring their rates down. But worse still, if they intend to use imported Chinese workers, they'll come with their families, and boom, population control of ethnics might be on the card from the Ukrainians. We in the West, or even Russia, have become so civilised that we cannot see the wood for the trees anymore. We're so hell-bent on importing minorities into our countries, for whatever reasons, that we lose sight of the fact that these are the people who are going to settle and breed, and they're going to treat any host country as their own in more ways than one. And we should be warned of the Chinese people especially, as rather like the Muslims, they do have a long-term project in mind. In fact, in my darker days, and believe it or not I do have them, I seriously think that China is looking on in Europe, looking at the vast expanding Islamic populations and thinking, we'll let them wear themselves out with civil wars or simply deporting Muslims, and then we will walk into virtually open countries and won't have the problems of massive immigration ourselves. We will make countries in Europe non-immigration countries like China, with just a few disposable indigenous Europeans. Don't imagine it couldn't happen, and we all know that after any long-winded or long-term civil battles or future problems that excessive multiculturalism will bring, we wouldn't all welcome a stable, seemingly protective new Chinese politician promising jobs, wealth and stability. I saw an insight into the Chinese character when I lived in Singapore. My mother and I had a house, courtesy of my half-brother, in the grounds of the former German embassy, and we had staff. One of which was the washi boy, who collected our clothes every day and returned them immaculate every evening. He must have been around 50ish, bless him, and apparently couldn't speak a word of English, and as our Mandarin and Cantonese were non-existent, I remember my mother trying to tell him that our bras did not need starching all the time. He smiled and smiled and smiled some more, and nodding like a noddy Buddha, he went off. Sure enough, the next batch of bras had been starched to an inch of their lives, and Mummy and I went out looking like Jane Mansfield around the chest. In all our time there, he increased the starch until our underwear practically had a social life all of its own. That is their strength. Yes, smile, yes, and they do exactly what they like. You have to admire it, don't you? And finally, not so kinky the Welsh, is it? Sex shop forced to close due to lack of kinky locals. The erotic bestseller 50 Shades of Grey is credited with causing everything from a jump in lingerie sales to a rise in handcuff emergencies. But one feat it has not managed to achieve it seems is the ignition of the passion of the people of Aberystwyth, the Telegraph reports. A sex shop that opened in the West Wales seaside town to cash in on the supposed new openness the book has engendered to experimentation in the bedroom has had to close amidst a distinct lack of interest from the locals. Trish Murray, the businesswoman behind the Nice and Naughty store, was left to conclude that the residents she was trying to cater to were just not kinky enough. Ms Murray, 48, said the members of the community were simply not queuing up to buy her range of sex toys, erotic literature and skimpy underwear. We couldn't sustain the business, it wasn't profitable, she said. Maybe people in Aberystwyth just aren't that kinky, who knows? The store was the only licensed sex shop in the university town where the Prince of Wales studied Welsh for a term in 1969. It had been the talk of the town with its imaginative shop window displays and saucy merchandise, but the chatter did not translate into sales. Eve Egerton, manager of the Cabin Cafe opposite the store, said, "I don't think they had much in the way of trade. But it gave us a laugh when we saw elderly couples going up to peer through their shop window. To be honest, I'm quite sad because the way they did the shop window display wasn't overtly sexual, it was quite comical." 2 staff have lost their jobs after the closure of the Nice and Naughty branch, which has 14 other stores across the country. This presenter says, "It doesn't surprise me at all. We've become a nation of watchers and readers, not doers. Give us an erotic or porno film or a vaguely smutty book and we're okay, but expect anything else like action? I'm also not shocked at the remark of the over-the-hillers looking in the windows. At least we remember what sex was, and it was usually not at the end of being blind drunk or drugged out of our minds. What happened to the European culture of mistresses kept women and high-class ladies of the night?" You've been listening to The World at 8. I am Lynn Mozart and I and the team at World at 8 and Radio Britain wish you all a very happy and a very safe weekend.